Well, thank you very much, Jess and Deborah, and thank you to all of you for spending part of this gorgeous Memorial Day inside. Over the course of the next hour or so, I plan to share with you the genesis of my most recent project, Developer Trays, which we've already spoken about. And to talk about directly how it relates to my professional life as a silver gelatin printer here in the city. I believe that anyone can successfully create powerful photographic projects that are connected to the work they do professionally. In my case, it's the analog process of photography that has connected these two very important facets. And I'd like to start talking about this with this self-portrait that I took in my darkroom in 2008. And you can see, as many of us I'm sure have spent time in the dark, it's not the most organized of places, or at least that's the way that I have my darkroom set up. But I do know where everything is and know how to use it. And you can see me over on the left-hand side by my enlarger. So this really serves as my first attempt to photograph my own personal darkroom experience, something that was really interesting to me and something that I wanted to share with everyone else. This was a 5-minute exposure that lasted the entire time of one print, from the exposure through the fixer, when I ended up pulling my sheet film out. Over the course of the next few years, I explored this concept thoroughly, which eventually led to my Developer Tray project. To give you a little backstory, I initially became interested in photography in high school. I was fortunate enough to take about 8 courses in those early foundation years. And by the time I went to get my undergraduate degree at Connecticut College, I was thoroughly investigating all photographic endeavors. What Jess had already mentioned earlier is that I spent some foundation years up at the Mann media workshops. And the summer after my sophomore year was the first time I went up there as a work-study student. It was a great opportunity, and if you have never been up there, it's a wonderful place to really be present, and I was there for 2 summers. But this first summer, I was able to be exposed to all the photographers that came and teach workshops. Every week, they would give a slide presentation, and you'd be able to be exposed to their work and then see them the next day at the dinner table and continue those discussions. That summer, I had the realization that I was not only excited about photography, but that I was particularly interested in making darkroom prints. That summer, I took some of the first images that I was thoroughly excited about, such as this one of a pawn shop truck, and this one of a local wall of a bank. This was in Waldoboro. I was really excited by the feeling that I would get when I would release the shutter and knew that I created a smaller portion of the vast world around me. On an image like this, it was nearly impossible for the viewer to know the scale of the space that I photographed. This was a 50-foot wall, but within the context of this photograph, it was impossible for someone else to really realize that that is what this was. The idea of choosing the information to reveal, as well as what to conceal from the viewer, was really interesting to me. Summer after my junior year, I went up to the Mann media workshops again, and this time I worked strictly in the darkrooms. Again, I was able to attend those weekly slideshows that really broadened my horizons, but more importantly, and what really made more of a difference for me, was that I was able to assist in the advanced darkroom classes of George Tice and Jim McGargy. I made copious notes and started to see printing in an entirely different light. I got up the courage to show my printed portfolio to George Tice and got the first critical review of my printing style. And many of my prints were too high in contrast for his liking, which was the first time that anyone had told me that, as I was a young 20-year-old. And it was something that I hadn't really even noticed and thought about in my own work. So I was excited to revisit these negatives and see if I could approach the images differently. And this was one of those images that I had shown George. This was a photograph from Florence, Italy. At this time, I was taking lots of photographs with my Hasselblad of walls and surfaces. I called them textural compositions, and they were heavily influenced by the work of Siskind and White, photographers that I had just found out about at that time. And to think about this time of discovery, too, when you're hearing these names and seeing work of photographers for the first time that just totally blow your mind, that's really how I felt when I was starting to see work of people like this. And this picture was taken in my staircase of where I was studying abroad. And every day I walked past this corner and paid attention to how the light was falling. Finally, after months of observing, I chose to take this photograph. And I just love how it's such a high contrast situation, but also has that soft light. It's like a combination of both. So here's another example of how I was approaching my prints, thanks to my discussion with George Tice. In a high contrast situation like this, which is a gravestone that I photographed in New Orleans and abstracted in this way, I was printing with my shadows very open, and my highlights would still have textures, right? This too was taken in bright sunlight in Florence, okay? And almost the entire picture is that textured highlight. So after that really life-altering summer, that second one that I had up at the Main Media Workshops, I made a connection with Jim McGargy. And he runs MV Labs, which is here in New York City, and told me to give him a call if I ever ended up here, and perhaps I'd be able to be an intern. When I graduated from Connecticut College in 2003, I did exactly that and reached out to him. And he told me that there was no opportunity there. I started going in as an intern, and on my second day there, his assistant printer had left. His assistant printer had worked with him for 5 years previous, and I knew that this was an opportunity that did not come very often. This was a prestigious lab, but very small, so it was only Jim and one other printer. So this was my opportunity. So I trailed him, and he was really just testing me to see if I had what it took to try to be a printer, and had really the strength to keep on trying to make prints that were better and better and better. I learned about split filtering, bleaching, consistent agitating methods, burning techniques, and all sorts of other skills. And they were essential, of course, but what I learned the most from Jim in those early days and throughout the 5 years that I ended up printing with him was how he approached each negative. Everyone was a puzzle. And what were we trying to say with it as a print? Okay, where would we guide the viewer to look with all of our adjustments? And how could we do that? And I didn't become a master printer overnight. And I would still show Jim every print as I was working on it for approval, as we were going through all our steps and before I'd move on to my next negative. But this discussion that would happen after every print, and I'm talking thousands of prints from the years that I worked with him, this discussion was really where my training occurred. And that's where I learned how to create a finished print that was true to the intention of the photographer whose work it was. And every photographer that we printed for had a different aesthetic that they were trying to look for. And I had the pleasure of printing work with and working with Matthew Barney and Marilyn Minter, Gordon Parks, James Noctway, Marilyn Bridges, and Antonine Kratochvil, lots of photographers. And depending on what they liked, we would give, like Antonine Kratochvil likes his prints incredibly heavy and dark, really rich, and then we would have to go in and bleach out the highlights. Someone like Matthew Barney really liked his work with high contrast, okay, where the blacks were completely rich and those highlights were nice and bright. So not only was I getting better at interpreting these negatives, but I was also getting to be really quick in the darkroom, which this was a commercial business, so that was something that was important. But in my own photography, all the while, I was continuing with my textural compositions, okay, where I'm searching for these textures and photographing throughout Brooklyn and New York City. This is paint over graffiti in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. And here's a reflection in Seattle of a Frank Gehry building. Again, another reflection, this time in Brooklyn, with slightly warped glass. And so almost all of my photographs up until this point were of flat surfaces, but I started to look at the interplay of lines with multiple depths within a frame. And so this is a good example of that, where we have the cable in the front kind of mimicking that cable that's on the side of the wall. And looking back at this work now, I realized that there was something else that I had been working towards during these early years of my photographic development. I was really creating images for the purpose of showcasing the skills that I had learned as a printer. This was the first example where I was blending my professional life as a printer directly with my life as a photographer. My printing abilities were essential to the success of the photographs, and the print was an extension of the work, okay? Something that I had to have complete control over and to do myself. This was very important to me at this stage. I also started to look at the work of some of the new topographic photographers. Photographers like Robert Adams and Louis Baltz, Stephen Shore, and the Beckers. I became interested in exploring how buildings and architectural infrastructure affected how we interacted with our surroundings as people, as humans. And here, these are some silos in Knoxville, Tennessee. And then back in Brooklyn, under the F train, and under the BQE. And small smokestacks with a few birds. And you can see with this grouping of pictures that I've added some life and people into these photographs, which is the first time that that's coming in my work. And it's a trait that didn't last very long, and I found myself more interested in the accumulation of wear associated with inhabitants as opposed to the inhabitants themselves. And I started to revisit some of my earlier work that I had done in college and viewed it under an entirely different context. And this was an image that I took in New London of an abandoned ballroom. I did a series of about 8 different ballrooms at that time. And I wasn't as interested in abstracting these subjects, but rather showing part of the scene. And I was starting to think about the histories of the places that I photographed. Was there information that could be learned by looking at these spaces? And I definitely believe that there was. And here's another staircase, also in New London, and this was behind a local Salvation Army. Here we have a barn wall in Switzerland, again paying attention to that light. And here's a pier in Sunset Park that wasn't being used and wasn't active at this point. But while I was creating these photographs, I was still working at MV Labs. Working there was really a wonderful experience, and it laid a strong foundation of skills for working in the analog world of photography. But the year was 2008, and the photography world was changing around us, especially in this silver printing world. There wasn't as much work being printed in the darkroom as there had been in the past. The business of work prints and contact sheets started to dry up as photographers began scanning their negatives themselves in order to save money, a practice that made a lot of sense. They would still bring their work back to us for their final exhibition prints, but we were getting a lot less work. As digital technologies continued to advance, many photographers were making the switch to digital cameras as well for their printing and for their shooting possibilities, as those materials were getting better and better. So as less and less silver gelatin printing business was coming into MV Labs, my hours were eventually cut. And the skill and trade that I had spent the last 5 years, my first 5 years here in the city, working to perfect, was now one that didn't really seem to have much of a future for me. And I decided to go back to school at the School of Visual Arts to get my MFA. So that first year, I continued to print 3 days a week at MV. And near the end of that year, MV Labs, which had been in the meatpacking district for 15 years, was forced to relocate due to an astronomical rent increase. As we know, that neighborhood has dramatically changed during that time. Not surprisingly, this all happened during the peak of the financial collapse in 2009. So just as I had relied upon my skills as a master printer to enhance my earlier photographic projects, I looked to my personal and professional practice for inspiration for another project. And during that first year of graduate school, I was walking along 14th Street from Little West 12th Street and Washington Avenue, where MV Labs was, all the way to SVA, which was on 21st Street between 2nd and 3rd. And this was my routine, and I observed it every day, kind of the same way that I was observing that apartment staircase that I had in Florence, and the way that we all do when we're photographing. Okay? As the economy kept deteriorating, more and more storefronts and businesses would close. And I was noticing this. These storefronts remained sitting for months at a time before another venture would rent them. And while I was walking past these empty storefronts along 14th Street, we were also packing up boxes to move MV Labs to its new location where it is now. So the once universal analog world of photography was no longer the only option for black and white printing. This was something that we had come to expect, and we're coming to terms with that. I saw these empty storefronts analogous to the traditional darkroom process, especially silver gelatin printing, as that it's not as nearly commercially viable as it once was. So on one morning, which was April 6, 2009, as an arbitrary day that I did this, I walked all along 14th Street and photographed all 20 available storefronts that were empty and looking to be leased. And I took one picture of each space and moved along to the next. As someone who is very rigid in their compositions, I freed myself up in this project to photographing more instinctually as a way to record the spaces in a manner that would replicate what it felt like to walk past them. In some ways, this is very similar to a lot of the work of Ed Ruscha, in particular his Sunset Strip work. And beyond the empty available real estate and the financial collapse, this was also my first project that dealt with the current state of analog photography, a theme that really continues throughout my work today. Because these spaces were staying on the market and no one was rushing to rent them, I saw them as relics of a past that couldn't quite keep up with the changing world around it. I didn't see these spaces as opportunities for new businesses, but rather as a gaping hole of loss and nostalgia for what was once there. So this series of 20 photographs is exhibited in a straight line going from the farthest western address all the way to the farthest eastern address. And it's a pretty ominous series to see in whole, and it's really because I was not feeling too optimistic about silver gelatin printing and my future at this point in my career. But it gets better. So silver analog photography, it had a broad history, and now is becoming a thing of the past. I started to think about how many photographers would still be shooting film in 5 years, 10 years, or even 20. And what was traditional photography's future? And so I photographed this project on expired Fuji Neopan 120 film and printed it on expired AGFA paper, both materials that were no longer produced, as a reference to the history's process and as well as its future. So silver gelatin printing was my livelihood, and I was not getting enough work to support myself off of that alone. It was a fairly bitter experience, and this project really helped me work through that process. So during the second year of graduate school, I opened my own printing studio in Brooklyn called Silver 68, which I still run today, and began to produce silver prints for photographers such as Mark Seliger, Barbara Mensch, Bruce Davidson, and Charles Traub. And now I didn't have to work 5 days a week to support myself and my own work. I could print commercially for 2 or 3 days and focus on my own photographic endeavors and the classes I was taking on those other days. And the analog silver gelatin process, something that I knew so well from my professional life, was still something that I wanted to explore in my own work. Continuing with the idea of analog versus digital reproduction, I started to think about how I or how I actually make editions of prints for photographers when I'm working commercially in my darkroom. And I know that no two prints made in the darkroom are ever exactly the same. No matter how much you try to make it perfectly the same, something will slightly change. Your enlarger will be a little warmer one time, your developer may cool down, you may agitate slightly different, okay? All of these things can make your images, even if I'm doing an edition of 10 of the same print, they're all going to be slightly different. And each one will have to take up to, if it's a difficult negative, 30 to 40 minutes making that exposure, adding all your burns, and running it through all the chemistry. So that's a lot of physical work. So think about that in comparison to the digital world that we live in, right? Where we put 10 minutes of work onto a file, or we work on a file for 3 months. Okay, no matter how much you put into that file, once it's saved, you're done, right? You press print, and you're going to have, as long as your printer is up to speed and everything's looking good, you're going to get the same copy of that print without all of that extra work that you have to put forward each time you make that print. So I knew that there was a major difference between the way that photographs were reproduced through analog and digital processes. And I touched across that in my other projects. But now I wanted to make something that was a unique darkroom print and without a negative. And since this, again, is work about light-sensitive materials, I chose salt as the subject that I would make a contact print of. And salt prints were made as part of the calotype process in the mid-19th century and resulted in some of the first positive prints that were ever made from negatives. And so in my salt prints, I laid salt down on varying papers and exposed the materials to light. And the results were randomized patterns, and every one was completely unique. Sometimes they almost look like galaxies or stars. But this also referenced my interest in textures that was coming back from my earlier work. But these textures here are not parts of the world around us. They are formed at one moment and only for that one moment during the exposure and then discarded. So these earlier projects served as strong foundations for my continued work. And at this point, it's 2010, and I was continuing to investigate light-sensitive materials and custom darkroom work. I was printing a large commercial job in the darkroom for Mark Seliger and was spending days at a time printing in order to meet an approaching deadline. And I was standing over my developer tray an awful lot and started to be drawn to that tray itself. And so I was initially drawn to its surface. The lines, the tones, and all of its scratches were visually appealing to me. And after that night's printing session, I took the tray out and photographed it as an abstract, so as to focus on the lines and scratches that were present on it and what initially drew me to that subject. And so I did this in my darkroom. I exposed it on black and white film, processed it, and then printed it in the darkroom as well. And this was the first photograph that I ever took of my developer tray. So this was my last semester at SVA. And I brought it into my critique class with the photographer Andrew Moore. And my fellow students were interested in the photograph, but not solely for the reasons that I had initially thought. And we started to think about the tray not as an abstraction like it is here, but rather as an object that could represent a photographer's darkroom experience. And this developer tray was my developer tray. And it should be shown entirely as such, not as just an abstract. And so I pulled my view camera up and photographed the entire tray. And so I first did this in black and white because I was doing a project about black and white photography, so why not make everything black and white and print it in the darkroom? And I thought that this would be the most representational way to do that. But I immediately knew that I would have to add a little bit of color and shoot it in color. So you can see that subtle shift, actually, where the black and white is right here. And my tray doesn't have that much color. But I've spent a lot of time in other darkrooms, and so I knew what the possibilities were, and I had seen some amazingly beautiful trays. So I didn't want to cross that off my list and just go ahead and shoot black and white trays, because how exciting would a book of 82 black and white trays be? So here's my developer tray, photographed in its current state so that it can live on forever. This is where all the images that I've ever printed in my darkroom have come to be into positive form. And this is the tray that I've stood over and over thousands of times, where I rock it for 2 minutes while I'm flipping my print. And I can see that image come to be under that soft amber glow that many of us have experienced. So after using this tray for about a decade, it looks the way it did. It looks the way it does because of everything that I've done to it. Right? It starts off as something we buy from B&H, because that's where we buy all of our photography materials. And we purchase that, and we add this character, right? From all of the years of usage, how we maintain it, the type of developer we use, how often we clean it, any of our printing habits. So once sterile and generic, it became one that was completely mine. And I knew that this transformation was one that wasn't going to be unique to my experience. All photographers' trays must have their own distinctive attributes. Beyond their unique colors, shapes, and sizes, every developer tray would have a history unlike any other. And once photographed and brought before a larger audience, the narratives within these developer trays manifest themselves not only visually, but also conceptually, in their ability to conjure the archives of each photographer in the minds of the viewer. So this discovery served as a catalyst for my developer tray project, and I immediately set off on a 3-year quest to photograph what ended up being 82 developer trays throughout the United States. So with this first tray, I had developed the method in which I wanted to photograph everything. I wanted it to be consistent so that we'd be able to compare each tray. So I would put down black velvet, put a tray on top of black velvet, put it next to available light. I would say, there was only 2 trays that I shot with a flash. Everything else was with available light. It's the benefit of visiting photographer studios. There's always a lot of nice natural light. So I'd put that tray down, and I would set up a tripod with my 4x5 right on top, make sure everything's level, and then put my film in and shoot it. And that's it. So a lot of these trips that I ended up doing, I could be in and out and taking my photograph and be finished in about 10 minutes. So the second tray that I photographed was that of Mark Seliger, because I was still getting my feet wet and I didn't really know how far this project was going to take me at this point. I had only photographed my own tray. But the second one was Mark Seliger, who I had printed for, so I had access to his darkroom. And so I shot his tray, and this is very different than my tray. They're both 16 by 20 inch trays, but you can already see the difference between, one is a Patterson, which is this manufacturer, and the other one was a Sesko Light, which was mine. So we have these trays that everyone ends up with, but this one, you can see he would fill the entire object with developer almost to the edge, so it's spilling over, and that's why it had that consistent brown color. So I reached out with as many connections as I had at this point to try to get my foot in the door and to meet these photographers and see if they would let me come and shoot their trays. And this was one by the photographer Barbara Mensch. And you can see here what will be a pattern in some of the other trays as well, is that you see a lot of silver deposits that are on the tray. And so, papers in the late 70s and early 80s had a lot more silver content. And when you would process, the silver would get deposited in these plastic surfaces. So she you can get a little attributes of what was going on in her experience, and she decided to clean one corner and then gave up on cleaning the rest after she scrubbed that bottom right. So Andrew Moore connected me with Emmett Gowan, which was this was also right at the beginning of my project. And so I went out to his home in Pennsylvania, and when I approached the house, I was greeted by Edith, his wife, who I knew from years of looking at Emmett's work. And she let me in, and as I was coming in, Emmett was coming down the stairs from his darkroom, and he was holding 5 developer trays. And this was the first time that I had a group of trays to choose from, and I was like very excited. This is like, oh, this is going to be fun. So I brought all the trays out and photographed them all and brought them back, and this was the tray. I always choose one tray as some sort of a portrait for the photographer, and this was the tray that I chose from him. And you can see that he wrote deck tall on the side, so I think we all know what his favorite developer is. But it also looks like he may have done some sort of toning in this tray, because there's all sorts of crazy colors going on here. But while I was visiting, this was the first instance, and this was the 3rd tray I shot. This was the first instance where I could sense that connection of photographers wanting to bring in their friends and bring in other photographers as well. So one of his friends is the photographer David Graham, who lives 5 doors over. So I went 5 doors over and photographed the developer tray of David Graham, who did a lot of Emmett Gowan's printing and also printed all of his own work in this tray as well. Another instance where this tray would lead to another tray was when I photographed Ralph Gibson, his developer tray. And so while I was visiting him downtown here, and this is the other nice thing about being based here in Brooklyn, is that a lot of the photographers who I included in this project were within a pretty close area to be able to travel. I did go out to California and to some other places too, and in the end people would ship me some trays to shoot. But being centrally located here really served as a great foundation for me to be able to have access to all these photographers. So when I was shooting Ralph's tray, he brought me into his darkroom and he showed me his enlarger, and he told me the history of his enlarger. And this was an old Leica enlarger that was originally Robert Frank's enlarger that he used to print all the works for the Americans. And after he was done with that, in the 1960s, Robert gave that enlarger to Larry Clark, who then used that enlarger for the next 15 years. And then Larry gave that enlarger to Ralph Gibson. So I chose the developer tray. But there are so many other artifacts that these photographers have that get handed on from one photographer to another. And for any of us who have experienced, photography like we all have, you probably have some pieces in your collection that are given to you by someone else. So I think it's a wonderful way to keep things in use if you're finding yourself not using it. And so he also then went under his sink and pulled out this tray. And this was the developer tray of Andreas Feininger. And Andreas had given him this tray in the mid-90s when he stopped printing in the darkroom. So this tray, which Ralph Gibson still uses today in addition to his other one, has this whole lineage and different ownership that continues from one person to another. This is Abe Fronlich, who I was put in touch with because he was one of the last assistants of Minor White, and I had been looking to try to find access to Minor White's darkroom materials, and I couldn't get anywhere. So I was put in touch with Abe, and Abe was his assistant when he had passed away and inherited part of his darkroom. And so one of the objects that he had was this developer tray that was Minor White's. So I was able to photograph both of these together on that same trip. This is the developer tray of Edward Mapplethorpe. And originally, This was used in Robert Mapplethorpe's studio, where Edward was the printer, along with Tom Barrell. But they printed at his studio down on Bond Street, and this 20 by 24 tray was the one that was used there. And then he brought it to his own home and has been printing with it since then. So as my project began to grow and I kept on reaching out and getting in touch with more and more people, I also got a lot more rejections, not in the terms of, no, you can't photograph my tray, but we actually don't have any tray for you to photograph. And so this was the case with the studios of Richard Avedon and Irving Penn, and Cindy Sherman and Richard Benson, people that I thought would really have a tray and still have darkroom materials, but did not. So darkrooms were closing and photographers were switching to digital. And if they weren't, they were outsourcing it to printers. But I knew that I had to keep on reaching out and trying to get more and more trays. And the sooner the better. Because in 5 years, I knew that a lot of these other trays that I had photographed would already be gone. So I just went for it and kept on reaching out. Here is a tray. This is Andrea Modica's tray. And so this is a 10 by 12 inch tray, and you can see all the silver. And she's used this since her time as an MFA student at Yale in the early 1980s to process every one of her silver gelatin negatives. So every 8 by 10 negative that she has processed has come through this tray. And here we start to see attributes of consistent ways that someone deals with their agitating methods. So you can see there are 3 fingerprints in the lower right corner from where she picks up her negative and lets it drain, and then flips it, picks it up and let it drain. Another way that we're seeing a tray of photographer, this is Aaron Siskind, and we can see his darkroom habits here as well. After every time that he would print, he would bleach the tray. Okay, so he was a little superstitious that if it was dirty, something would happen to the print. But I think we've learned from looking at everyone else's trays that he was probably alone in that category. This is the tray of Linda Connor. And you can see this is an 11 by 14 inch tray with a circle right in the middle. So she would drag with her finger around in a circular motion that 8 by 10 photograph. And you can see its motion just like that. So these trays, because of their plastic surface, really took on a different life because of how they were treated. And so it's really a part of the artistic process that's recorded here. And I'm simply just trying to share that with us. This is an intimate part of these people's darkrooms that had not been seen. This is a tray by Mark Cohen. And he's a color and black and white printer. And he would use the same tray. So he has some weird abnormalities going on in this tray. It's also deep. And the day that I went to photograph this, there was still 3 inches of developer sitting from a hot night in the summer. And so it had a little bit of extra color when I shot it, which was nice. This is Bruce Davidson's developer tray. And so this was it's a 16 by 20 tray. It was custom made in Chinatown in the 1970s. And every time I see it, I wonder if that dent was originally there or if he just had a bad darkroom day. I don't know. I'll have to ask him. This is Richard Mishrak. And this is the only tray that I used that wasn't necessarily full of developer. And in his Stonehenge project that he did in the late 1970s, the essential aspect of that work was that he split toned them in the end. And this is his split toning tray. And it's really quite stunning. 16 by 20. So here we have Lillian Bassman, another unique tray. And this is just a 16 by 20 rubberized tray. And she used to put potassium ferrocyanide in the developer while the print was being processed. And therefore, we have this blue residue all throughout the surface. That's unlike any other photographer's process I've ever heard. Whenever I bleach, I always do it after it's been fixed. But that's what she did. And if you're familiar with her work, she has really dramatic bleaching. This was her husband's tray. And this is an example of families that are involved with darkroom printing. And this is Paul Himmel, who Lillian Bassman's husband, who was also a photographer. I shot his tray, as well as their daughter, Lizzie Himmel. And so afterwards, every time I would shoot a photographer's tray, I'd give them a print as a thank you. And so Lizzie has the 3 prints hanging as a family portrait, she tells me. And here again, familial, okay? This is Amanda Means, her developer tray. And this is her late husband, John Copeland's. This was a custom-made mural tray. Win Bullock, who I photographed out in California, his tray. And when he passed away in the mid-1970s, his wife, Edna Bullock, and this is her tray, took up photography, but used a different tray. So there is an interesting personal relationship that people do have with their darkroom materials. And so this tray, in terms of an object that has a vast history, this is one of the strongest. And this is Neil Selkirk's developer tray. And I called him early on in the project to see if he had a picture, because I knew of his work, and I also knew that almost any time you see an estate print of Diane Arbus, it always says printed by Neil Selkirk. So he prints all of her work for the estate. So I was thinking, oh, this would be great, because I couldn't find any of Arbus's material, so I wanted something for her. So he says, yes, I definitely have the tray for you. So he calls me back, and he tells me that in the early 1970s, after she had passed away, and he was put responsible for the production of all these prints, he didn't have enough darkroom materials, and he didn't have any money. So he called Richard Avedon, and Richard Avedon had a beautiful studio and had lots of extra trays, and asked him if he would be able to give him some trays. So this was originally a developer tray from Richard Avedon's studio that was given to Neil Selkirk in 1972 for the printing of all of his own work and Arbus's work, and was used up until about 2003 or 2004 when he retired it, because you can see that there's actual cracks on that surface. And for any of us who've spent time in the darkroom, if we have a siphon water filter, you put the tray and you have another tray that's below it to raise the tray so that you can, the filter doesn't fall in the drain. So he put this face down in his sink where it still is today, and so it has this beautiful green mold on it, which really makes for an aesthetically pleasing photograph. This is the tray of Vera Luder, and she used this for her mural work in anytime she was shooting in the United States. She has a separate darkroom in Europe for when she shoots there. But again, to show the attachment that some photographers have for their darkroom materials, she doesn't use this anymore, but she's kept it for an additional 5 years just because she had good experiences with it. But she doesn't use it because one of her assistants put boiling water in it to try to clean it. And so you can see that it's not perfectly shaped in the middle. And everything has to be perfect for her and her aesthetic. So she uses other trays, but didn't quite have the heart to throw this one out. And I was able to go into some wonderful institutions. So I got to go to the Smithsonian, the photo history collection there. And this was about 5 by 9 inches, just to get an idea of the size of this. And this is from the mid-1800s, early photography. It almost looks like a cake pan or a baking pan. And here's another one from their collection. This was used in for daguerreotypes in the 1850s. It was from a travel set that they still had intact there. This is from the photo studio of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And so this is what they used to process all the copy work when they were photographing and had black and white reproductions. Obviously not used anymore. They don't really do darkroom work there much at this point in the day. And here is Ansel Adams' tray. And this happened pretty early on in the project. I got word from Michael Adams, who's Ansel's son, and he told me that yes, they had trays, and yes, they had his entire darkroom fully intact, the way that it was when he had passed away. So in Carmel, well, I had made that connection, then I knew I had to go. So I planned a whole California trip around it, where I was able to photograph 12 different photographers during that time. But getting Ansel was incredibly important for this book. As someone who literally wrote the book on black and white printing and processing. And so when I arrived in this darkroom, I saw his custom enlarger, which is unlike anything I've ever seen before. It had 64 different lights on the back, and it was an 8x10 that was on a track system, so he was doing everything projected on the wall. And it had 64 switches. And if he just turned on the corners, then he would have a natural edge burn. And if he just turned on, you know, number 32, that was something in the middle, that one area would be a little darker than everywhere else. So that was pretty amazing too. But then, kind of going back to my experience with Emmett Gowan, where he brought down 5 trays, I showed up here, and there were at least 20 different trays underneath the sink. So I was like a kid in a candy store. But this is the one that I chose to represent Ansel for this project. And I also was able to go down to Sally Mann's farm in Virginia. And I had been trying to get in touch with her for a while, and then out of the blue, she just wrote back to me and said, oh yeah, I have a little bit of free time. So the next day, I showed up in Virginia, and I just hopped in my car and went down. But visiting her darkroom was also a wonderful experience, and bringing the tray, photographing it outside while I had her 6 dogs running around me, and I was worried that they were going to knock over my camera. But it all worked out, and that was a great addition as well. This is Adam Foose, and this is a 40x50 custom-made stainless steel tray. This was the only one that I wasn't able to put my camera above. I had to prop it up on the side in his darkroom and shoot it directly facing in. And while I'm setting up and moving things around, he just left me in the darkroom to do this. I started hearing some rustles coming from the corner of the room. And if you're familiar with his work, you know that he works a lot with snakes. And so the next thing I knew, I look over and I see crates and crates and crates of the snakes that he uses in his work. I'm like, oh yeah, of course, that's where they should be, in the corner of his darkroom. And then near the end of the project, people were mailing me some trays. So this was Michael Kenna and Joel-Peter Witkin. So I wasn't able to visit their studios. So out of all the objects that are used in analog production, it's kind of why the developer tray? And it's because at this time there's no object from a photographer's digital process that has the functional longevity of a well-worn and well-used developer tray. Digital cameras, printers, scanners, and computers continually need to be upgraded, and there's always a better one, and they become obsolete years after you have purchased them. Developer tray does not face this predicament and is never replaced for a newer model. So this tray is Sid Kaplan's tray. And he's a photographer here in the city, So he's processed all his own work here, but he also has processed Robert Frank's work and Ouija's work. And you can see that he hits that print down from those patterns, the way that he agitates. And he's used this tray for about 60 years. Okay, so there's no point where you just decide you need to get a new tray. But again, I guess it does come back to superstitions. How we had Aaron Siskind, who was bleaching everything. And then we also, I photographed George Tice's tray, and George just buys a new tray every 5 years for no reason other than that's just what he does. So along with the longevity comes the growing number of prints that have been and continue to be produced within all of these collective developer trays. And even when the darkrooms housing the trays that I photographed close, the intimate objects will live on just as the photographer's work is alive in all of our minds. An essential aspect of the individual darkroom experiences of these photographers has been recorded for posterity, ready to captivate the imaginations of people viewing these fully transformed, unique utilitarian objects. And I truly believe that this project could not have been created if it wasn't for my profession as a silver gelatin printer. My developer tray alone is an intimate object that I use regularly and for my own personal and commercial projects, melding the two. And I'd like to end with Jerry Ulsman's tray, because his work, when I set out to do this, I was thinking of Ansel Adams, I was thinking of Sally Mann, I was thinking of Jerry Ulsman. And I finally was able to shoot his tray as the project was finishing up. But he is just a master of darkroom manipulation, the pre-Photoshop alternate realities, created by having 7 enlargers set up with different negatives and moving the paper from side to side. And so I like to end with this tray that he has used since the early 1960s. And I'd also like to end with a quote that's found in my book from Lyle Rexer, who wrote the introduction. And he says that Sears trays may look like melancholic mementos, but they aren't. They are reminders that photographs are not really objects at all. They are pictures in our heads. That's where they are meant to live and where they will outlive every technological revolution, remaining vivid as each brave new world fades and disappears. So on that note, I'd like to thank you all for your time and enjoy the rest of Memorial Day. Thank you.
Whether you're a hobbyist or a professional, B&H has the answers to your questions. Experience a world of technology at our New York City Superstore. Connect with us online or give us a call. Our staff of experts is happy to help.